Well, it's an extraordinarily pessimistic time. Most people think to be talking about the future. I'm basically quite optimistic about the next 2 decades, and I'll try and explain why. But I'm not a great believer in our ability to forecast at all accurately what's going to happen. So everything is qualified in that respect. I'm very taken by the idea that the future tense does not exist in Estonian, and I've been pondering how that would change my vision of the world if I took that a little bit seriously. As I say, I'm going to talk about the next two decades. I want to talk quite a lot about the United States. Now, I'm very well aware of people saying rightly that the next century is going to be the Asian century, but I think century is too long a period of time to be thinking, and I'm going to be thinking really about the next 2 decades. And in the next 2 decades, America is going to be pretty central to everything which goes on. Now, I hope not too many of you watched the truly awful debate between Joe Biden and Donald Trump last night, and to hope that things don't turn out quite as badly as that. But I want still to talk about the United States, because that's actually where I think most of the really core innovation has traditionally taken place. And although I think China is in a number of different areas doing incredibly well, I think in a whole range of core technologies, America is still just in the lead. But I want to talk quite a lot about that. As I see it, what I'm going to talk about are what I see as the 2 major problems of the current advanced world. The first is obviously the future of democracy, and here we're talking about the United States. I'm not going to talk about the United Kingdom, where we have our own craziness, as I'm sure you're aware, and I feel deeply upset that we're leaving the European Union. The first problem, anyway, is the future of democracy, and I'm going to, especially in the United States. The second problem, which is less explicitly pointed to but is critical, is the major slowdown in innovation and productivity growth during the 21st century. The last 20 years, or maybe 15 years, before the financial crisis, have seen a major slowdown in innovation. And this should be the last thing we would be thinking would happen in this incredible ICT world which we live in. But it's, even with many qualifications, it's true. Now, there are obviously at least 2 or 3 other huge problems we're confronting. The whole US-China conflict, which if I got a moment, I'll talk a little bit about later, and the future of the EU, which I'm actually becoming more optimistic about, particularly with Germany assuming some real autonomous leadership. And the third thing, of course, is COVID. And I'll end up by talking a little bit about COVID, which I think is actually going to lead to a major economic growth after COVID, because there'll be so much to be done. First thing I want to say is this: it's in relation to the pessimism which we're looking at the world at the moment. I find it very useful, both in my research and in my teaching and thinking about things, to think in terms of the whole Industrial Revolution as being a series of great technological waves with steam and then electricity and then the internal combustion engine and assembly line, Fordism, assembly line production. And in the last 30 years, the internet and the semiconductor, the ICT revolution. And we're in the latest, should I say, of very prolonged technological waves, and it's clear that these technological waves, as Schumpeter pointed out long ago in his work, his idea of creative destruction, these technological waves have moved the world, particularly the advanced world, from really grinding poverty in the first half of the 19th century for a very large proportion of people to the world we live in now, where most people live, if not difficult, some of them difficult lives, but at least materially comfortable lives. What's important is this process of successive major waves has been profoundly destabilizing. Each of these waves have lasted for long periods, 70 or 80 years, and we're only 30 years into the latest wave. But it's not surprising that we're in a difficult way, a difficult phase of this, because what creative destruction teaches us is that the wave of breakthroughs which come with any major, huge innovation carries with it the destruction of a whole lot of ways of life. So we're in a situation where the current wave has created a large class of left behinds, former industrial workers, largely men, but also many white collar workers whose work has now been overtaken by AI, or whose jobs are now automated. So it's not surprising that we are in the middle of major populist reaction. Much worse, I would say, in America and the United Kingdom, because we tend to have very first past the post government. We're bad at negotiating change, bad at including different groups in change. So if you go back to the previous waves of technological change, you find very similar things. The end of the 19th century, terrific populist movements in the United States, people deeply pessimistic about the future. Same was true again in the ICE, internal combustion engine revolution and Fordism. The 1930s is exactly the same sort of period, one of deep pessimism. So we should not think that there's anything historically surprising about the world which we're in at the moment. In fact, it's interesting that each of the previous massive technological waves are also accompanied by financial crises as countries, advanced countries, tried to learn how to deal with the risks associated with these new methods of production. Nobody knew what the real risks were. They were each actually associated with a major slowdown in growth and a slowdown in productivity growth and growth in real incomes. So I would say, first of all, to put a balance on it, we shouldn't think too much about this being a uniquely pessimistic period. And the reason for that is that we should also bear in mind that there has been a great rise in the number of those who've benefited from the digital economy, from the advanced economy which we live in nowadays. And if I was to ask, what do I see as a fundamental reason why America is, and indeed the UK, are unlikely to really ditch democracy or whatever, is that there is a gradual increase in the percentage of younger, well-educated voters of both genders. Gender integration has been an extraordinary phenomenon of the last 20 years or so, and a growing importance of the major successful cities, New York, the whole Silicon Valley, San Francisco area, Washington DC actually, and Boston would be just starting examples in the United States. So, as support for the Democratic Party in the United States, which really is the representative of this younger, well-educated electorate, as support for the Democratic Party in the United States shows at the moment, there is a significant majority, a significant numerical majority of Democratic supporters in the US. And the reason, in a certain sense, why we've been so worried about the United States has been this fact that the electoral rules in the United States, with their electoral college and so on, and the way the Senate works, simply distort Democratic majorities. We've had somewhat different problems in the United Kingdom with on the one hand, a Conservative Party which has been basically coming to pieces in the last sort of 6 or 7 years since the 5 years since the referendum, and a Labour Party which was for some years led by a totally unimpressive left-wing group who had no strong sense of how to get to the middle of the road of the electorate. So I take a long-term optimistic view, that's to say of the next 10, 20, 30 years, I take an optimistic view about democracy. What about the US elections then, you may well ask? And all we can say is that the likelihood is clearly that Biden will win. The more important elections are actually the Senate elections, and there is a possibility that the Democrats will get 50 seats. Will win 3 seats. But it's only a possibility, and that will be difficult if Biden wins and has to face a Republican Senate. Well, the Democratic question: will Trump throw the elections? I actually think it's unlikely. Even a changed Supreme Court is going to be very, very cautious about underwriting any attempts by Trump, for instance, to delay to change the election result. It's becoming increasingly clear from a lot of things which have come out that the senior military are strongly opposed to playing any role in a situation like that. The police forces in the United States are not controlled at a federal level or even at a state level. They're controlled by localities, by big cities and so on. And the idea that you could use the police in a major way seems not very plausible. And finally, the security services are deeply hostile to Trump. Trump seems to have gone out of his way to make the senior military and the leaders of the security services pretty unhappy with him as president. So I personally don't see any real likelihood that Trump will try and change the result of the election. Moreover, if Trump did win, what I see as happening is that the federal government will increasingly play a lesser role, and the big cities and the big states, particularly California, Massachusetts, New York, and I should add Washington, D.C., but a whole number of other advanced states will increasingly, as they're already starting to do, coordinate their activities against Trump decisions by the federal government. The second major problem which is faced at the moment is this slowdown of innovation and productivity growth. And on the one hand, obviously, one shouldn't exaggerate that. I mean, just simply looking around us, there are amazing things going on in terms of mobile communications, AI in the life sciences, and so on and so forth. But there's a lot of expert opinion, I would say, particularly in the United States, which has pointed to a real slowdown in innovation. And there's no question that productivity growth, even when one makes a whole lot of statistical corrections, that productivity growth has also slowed down in this country, for instance, to very, very low levels. I focus on the US because the US has for a long time been the driver of radical innovation. As I said earlier, there are a whole number of areas where China is catching up, but I think few people would say that the driving force in a whole lot of real breakthroughs is still the United States rather than China. So why has radical innovation been so difficult in America in the past 20, even 25 years? Well, first of all, perhaps most important, there has been a massive withdrawal by the state, particularly by the federal state, from R&D expenditure. It is simply since, if we go back to, say, the late 1980s, public R&D expenditure has dropped dramatically as a percentage of both of GDP and of total R&D expenditure. Moreover, the decline in R&D has basically hit basic science, and basic science in the top universities is where, in the past, so many of the American Nobel Prizes have come from? That's the first major problem. The second problem is that there has been a similar pullback from R&D in basic science in the private sector. It used to be the case in the 50s and 60s, indeed earlier than that indeed going back to the turn of the last century, that the big American companies in chemicals and electroengineering and so on had big research departments, and those research departments did a great deal of basic research. So despite the fact that the FANG companies have obviously increased their have done a massive amount of research. Now the FANG companies are still concerned about the bottom line, and that's even more so for venture capital. Venture capitalists obviously aren't prepared to finance basic science. The third major problem has been that the slowdown of growth of GDP growth has also led to a real concern by companies thinking about major sunk investments in R&D. So why has this change come about? I think it reflects two things. One, in the advanced world generally, the adoption of a neoliberal economic framework, really from the late 1980s on, has played down the role of the state in a whole range of ways which we know, and has raised the role of shareholder value in the private sector. And both of those things have hit hard against basic R&D. Now, I think it can be said probably that I would say that the neoliberal framework was probably necessary in the 1980s and 1990s if the ICT revolution was to succeed, because it was a world, say in the 70s, of strongly organized big business, with powerful big business unions in throughout manufacturing, pretty conservative financial sectors, not really happy about taking major risks, and all within the protective framework of a strong and supportive state. And this all worked very well in a Fordist world of technology, but it needed to be dismantled. And as a result, if you were ready to try and go for Schumpeterian creative destruction in bringing about an ICT world, so I think that's what was behind the neoliberal framework adoption. But I think an awful lot of people now, from different sides of the political spectrum, think the neoliberal framework just went too far. The state has pulled back in too many ways, and the private sector has pulled back in too many ways as well. Second major factor behind these problems, in the United States particularly, there's been a major split on the role of the state. The Republicans have taken the position that the state does no good. It goes back to Reagan. Eisenhower didn't think this. It goes back to Reagan and Bush's and Trump. The Republicans have become a low tax, minimal state party deeply opposed to public expenditure. The Democrats, on the other hand, with their support from the educated, younger, big city, young professionals, and so on, concerned with the environment, concerned with issues like public transport, effective public transport, housing, education, health, and so on. The Democratic Party has gone in the opposite direction. And that's, as it were, basically as I see it, the current situation. So I'm tolerably hopeful that the political situation will change in the United States, and we'll see the start of that quite soon. And if that really happens, I think it will happen in one form or another. Then I can see that the next 10 or 20 years in the United States can get very much better as far as basic research and hence innovation and productivity growth is concerned. So, from a longer run perspective, 2 decades long perspective, I see democracy in the advanced world based on a younger, well-educated, gender integrated and big city and metropolitan electorate. I see democracy flourishing and pushing the state, not to become a big state, but pushing the state in the right directions, particularly actually at the city level, but also as far as research is concerned at the federal level and hopefully at the state level as well. So core issues in the next 2 decades, but certainly the next decade, health, education and care, very obviously. Then pretty centrally, the role of the environment and being able to live comfortably in big cities with effective transport, where the transport itself is obviously electrical vehicles, hopefully the development of autonomous electrical vehicles. And if we were talking about energy, we would be talking about fuel cell electrical vehicles, and the role of hydrogen, as well as the role of batteries and electricity in the ordinary sense. But in any case, we're going to be looking towards smart cities and critically research. So I see in the next decade extending university education, especially university education with a strong vocational element to it, linked to development of graduate jobs. I see these as politically central issues. So very, very briefly to mention 3 issues which I haven't mentioned. On China, I'm actually a great admirer of what's happened in China with a whole lot of obvious qualifications. And it's clear that the government both wants a real spread of education, higher education, and movement into the cities, but it's deeply concerned for the party to keep control of the governmental framework which it has. And one way of looking at the Hong Kong issue, deeply distressing as it is that the Chinese government is actually really worried not about Hong Kong. It's really worried about Shenzhen, this huge, growing community just on the edge of Hong Kong. The idea and highly dynamic and research leading and so on and so forth. And I think for the Chinese government, the idea that Shenzhen might link up in democracy terms with Hong Kong is a hugely worrying thing to have. We could go on about China for a lot, but it will. But I think if America becomes more stable, the Chinese government will have a great incentive to work with America because it depends so much on American universities. I won't say more about the EU. I'm actually quite optimistic about the EU because of Germany and maybe because of France. I'm very upbeat, by the way, about Estonia. That would be that's one of the things I slip into my teaching to graduates in teaching them about the political economy of the ICT revolution. And finally, I'd say about COVID. We're very pessimistic, obviously, about COVID at the moment. I think there's going to be the most massive economic boom when COVID is finally beaten, because as at the end of the Second World War, the infrastructure of life in the advanced world has become so run down by COVID that a lot of change is going to take place. Thank you very much indeed, and I'll be very happy to take questions or better still to take comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. This was both insightful and very clearly put. I've rarely come up a speech like yours, so I'm really grateful for that. We've got quite many questions, as the talk has triggered quite a lot of thinking. And I encourage the audience to even ask more. Of course, I have to do a selection, but anyway, the more discussion, the better. And I also give a chance to the people in the room to ask questions through the microphone that will be provided to you when you raise your hand. Well, I'll start with your notion that we probably would need another or a new or a different political system, that the division between the conservative and liberal thinking might not be fit enough for the future. So here are a couple of questions related to this. First is, what are your thoughts about direct democracy? Should we learn more about the opportunities it might hold and move more toward direct democracy in the next century in the West? And relatedly, what other thoughts or comments you might have, what is about how the future political system could look different of what we've got today?
Okay, that's a great question, and it's a centrally important question. I think my own view is we're moving away from this division between conservatism and liberals, just as we're moving away. I think, and this is I'm saying this in a much more powerful way. I think we're moving away from a division between social democracy, if social democracy means trade unions, the old working class, and so on, to a division between what one might loosely call a populist view of the world, which is a sort of conservative view of the world, it's not surprising that the Conservative Party in the UK is now embracing former Labour constituencies, which were very, very long-standing Labour industrial constituencies. Conservative Party here is directing itself towards them. So I think I'd arguably think we're moving from conservative versus liberal to a conservative, nationalist, populist, small town, ex-industrial party or approach, symbolic approach actually, versus a party or parties which represent this new electorate. So it's not surprising that the Green Party is now gradually starting really to do well in Germany, which I take as sort of bellwether country in Europe, and indeed to have be progressively pushing the Social Democrats down, so quite what that other party, if we do conservative versus liberal, quite what that other party is going to be is open to question. But here is a real problem, and you hinted at this in the question. Will there be political parties? Will political parties operate in the same way? Political parties, like the Roman Catholic Church, operated essentially for a long, long time pretty hierarchically, where you had a leader who took decisions about what the policy would be, and the party didn't change its views very much, but certainly political parties were the parties where policy making basically, political parties plus the civil service, where policy making basically came from. But those political parties were hierarchical. It's very difficult to run a hierarchical party at the moment. I've talked to various politicians about this, simply because everybody can communicate now in a horizontal way. You can set up little groups. You can talk without your leaders or your chief whips or whatever it is trying to enforce anything. It's becoming increasingly difficult to enforce discipline. So what's happened in the Conservative Party, for instance, has been people like Johnson have split off from essentially split off from ship and persuaded enough people that they're going to be capable of winning an election for the whole party to switch over to support them. So parties, I think, in the way in which we used to think of them, are likely to become a thing of the past. I think I would say that think tanks are becoming increasingly important. Think tanks are cheap to set up, easy to rearrange. People can move from one to another. And a lot of discussion takes place now, I would say, in think tanks. If you're an ambitious politician, you need to get a think tank on your side or to help you. So I'm not so sure about direct democracy. I'm not super keen on it yet, because it's been associated with so many problematic things. I think we're going to see a really different world of policy making. I think in this country, for instance, where the civil service was very, very high class, progressive governments have, particularly conservative governments, have really dismantled the civil service in terms of serious policy making and advice. So I think we're going to see a much more fluid type of world in which the media is going to become super important. Think tanks are going to become super important. There will have to be obviously some form of organization. But if you look at the States, you see that an awful lot of stuff just takes place online, and people have their, if you're a Democrat or whatever, or you have a particular political point of view, you tend to have your own set of online media which you go to, or maybe even Facebook and so on. So I see a really change coming, but I'm completely sure what form it will take. But it means that parties are going to have to become much more horizontal. They're going to have to become much more decisions taken at a very low level, discussion groups, not clear whether parties will have clear political decisions as in the political perspectives as in the past. And you can see this happening in a lot of trade unions. Above all, you can see this happening in companies. Big companies have been forced to become much more horizontal than they were in the. You can see this happening. I would say that I'm Catholic, but you can see this happening in the Catholic Church as the poor Pope battles the forces of indiscretion, which are very easily put about. Anyway, I'll stop. Sorry.
Yeah. So. Yeah, I do get it that both is needed, a new thinking and also a new kind of operation in how to operate a party and how to mobilize the people in the future. Very small last question, as we have issues with the time schedule already, but I cannot leave it unasked because it's a question from the audience, very intriguing. Does China move towards more democracy, or does the world move towards Chinese political system? Very brief answer, if you could.
Okay. I think China is going to be forced to move towards more democracy. I think it's really, if it really wants to be the leading player or the real challenger in advanced technologies, you can't do that without having very, very open top universities, and that's a problem for China. I think Hong Kong is going to be fascinating to see what happens. I mean, one thing which will happen is that an awful lot of Hong Kong citizens will move to the UK. We absolutely love to have well-educated, entrepreneurial Hong Kong citizens come to the UK, or even to Taiwan. And Taiwan itself, of course, is very, very, very impressive place. And I would think that the Chinese would be very cautious before they started moving against Taiwan. But I can see the Chinese government has a huge problem on its hand. I don't think we're going to become like China. I think China may become more democratic, or may split up in the way in which it becomes more democratic.
Thank you for the optimism. And I wish we would have a couple of more hours to discuss about these things. So reluctantly, I have to wrap it up now, as there's time to move on with the agenda. Thank you so much, David, again, for your time and effort. And I wish you luck with the work at the new book. Sounds extremely interesting.